You know, we saw Trump sending FBI agents to seize ballots in Georgia. We heard his speech days ago lying about China's involvement to explain his loss in 2020. We lived through the January 6th insurrection where he refused to accept the election's outcome. And in an effort to stay in power, we hear him lie and whine constantly about rigged elections and repeat his big lie that the 2020 election was stolen. Based on what you've seen so far, what's the plan for the November midterms? Will there be interference and will it affect the outcome?
Will there be interference? Yes. Will it affect the outcome? That's up to us. And let me be more specific on both. Will there be interference? It's already underway. The president has announced unprecedented efforts to affect the midterm elections. These efforts to coerce states across the country to hand over their voter rolls, to use an unproven database inside the Department of Homeland Security to decide who is basically allowed to vote and who is not based on their immigration status or whatever other criteria the administration might inject into that code is reckless, to say the very least, is a direct attack on our democracy and our democratic rights. Fortunately, there's been remarkable pushback in the states, in the courts. Judge after judge has been striking down Donald Trump's efforts to get states to hand over those voter rolls, to try to take over mail-in voting in this country by having the U.S. Postal Service decide whose mail-in ballots get delivered and whose don't. So the meddling is happening. It's underway. Yeah. Donald Trump is likely to deploy other efforts.
It's not hard to see that it's happening.
Not hard to see. And, you know, look, we need to be prepared for the fact that as the vote tallies start to come in and Trump's team starts to say to him, hey, sir, we're losing in this election and this election and this election. Looks like we could lose the House. Looks like we could lose the Senate. They're going to decide what states they find fraud in and send in federal agents, do what they did in Fulton County, try to seize ballots, try to cast those elections as fraudulent. And we already know how they're going to do it. I'm going to tell you how that's going to play out in the days after the election. They're going to say, pick a state that hasn't forked over its voter rolls, California. They're going to say, hey, in that contested race in Northern California, where that Republican's running against that Democrat, California didn't hand over their voter rolls. We think there's a good chance there's illegals voting in that election. We're going to go send the FBI, or, as Trump said in January of this year, he wishes he'd sent the National Guard to go seize voting machines. He's going to try to take on those efforts. The bad news for him is he's giving states and localities a whole lot more time to prepare than any of us had in 2020 when Donald Trump claimed the election was fraudulent. That caught, it shouldn't have, and we can talk about that later, it caught most people by surprise in 2020, and they scrambled to defend against Donald Trump's claims of fraud. Now they know it's coming. Now they know he's going to literally try to put his hands on their ballots. They're preparing lawsuits. They're getting their people prepared. But the reason I say it's up to us as the American people is the single best antidote we have to an attempted takeover of our elections is turnout. Yeah. And I'll tell you, throughout the past 100 years, we see that in every single autocracy or quasi-dictatorship around the world, that when the leaders try to meddle to win the vote, because rarely do they just cancel elections, because that's a concession that they've just stolen them, right? Mm-hmm. And that's too obvious to say, I'm just canceling the elections. Then the people are mad. But if they act like they're playing by the rules and they try to tilt the vote in their favor, but it was a blowout for the political opposition, well, then the people know something's wrong. They say, I waited in the line to vote for 3 hours. There's no way that the election was for his side. That's what we need to do in this country, is an extraordinary voter turnout.
And I will, I will get to what I would consider hope, as in massive turnout and what that makes possible. My one follow-up here is really the question of how much you expect this is going to play out, obviously not just before the election, but is it going to be weeks and weeks and weeks of uncertainty, sort of given all the ways in which they may try to manipulate and sow doubt after the election?
Probably. Much like the 2020 election, which, even though it was clear a few days in, took a few days to finalize some of those competitive races. Granted, that was a presidential election. The nation was still on pins and needles. Donald Trump is going to try to drag this out, and every district is different, and they're going to take advantage of the fact that every district is different, every race is different. They can potentially deploy different opportunities to meddle in different districts. In one place, they might say it was voter fraud and go seize the ballots. In another place, they might say they have concerns or questions about the integrity of the voting machines, and they may file petitions there. There's going to be an array of efforts to try to tie up these competitive races in litigations, in swirling questions, with the hope that Donald Trump and team can buy time and potentially buy air cover for the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, to refuse to seat people who've been elected. It's not conspiracy theory anymore. That's the likeliest path this is going to take. But they're going to have a harder time making that case if all the states and localities and the voters are prepared for this nonsense. If the elections are above board, if they are transparent, and if the fact pattern in the courts benefits the people who obey the rule of law as opposed to those who don't. And again, that's another silver lining I think Trump is giving us, is he's giving us lead time to stall and thwart a lot of his meddling.
So let's go a little farther into this. What worries you the most about how he's manipulated the election systems, disbanded groups responsible for monitoring or overseeing elections, threatened to involve federal forces, and the constant effort, the ongoing effort to sow doubt and undermine trust in the election process? What worries you the most?
Well, I do. You named it. It is the dismantling of the existing election security architecture, at least at the federal level. I mean, here's what Trump's not able to do. He doesn't control the secretaries of state in individual states that are in charge of their voting. He doesn't control the local election officials. They're trying to. They're trying to coerce them and intimidate them and threaten them with prosecutions if they don't fork over voter data to this White House. But so far, I think they've been unsuccessful in making that intimidation work. But what did work in 2020 is that Donald Trump's own team was able to certify the election was secure. And I know because I helped build that team. My former colleague, Chris Krebs, we put him in charge of the election security agency for the federal government. He was a handpicked Trump appointee. He started the day before me at the Department of Homeland Security and eventually became the head of the agency that oversaw our nation's election security efforts on behalf of the president. And after Trump started claiming the election was stolen, Chris Krebs was able to come forward publicly and say, no, Mr. President, it wasn't. In fact, because of your administration's efforts, it was one of the most secure elections, if not the most secure in American history. Unfortunately, Donald Trump has taken those structures that helped certify the integrity of the election in 2020 and has dismantled them so that they can't do that, so that the bureaucracy cannot step forward and say, the president's wrong. It actually was secure. He's disbanded the FBI teams, the DHS teams, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And ironically, these were all the functions Donald Trump pointed to in his speech last week when he said that the Chinese meddled in the 2020 election. Well, unsaid in his remarks is the reason they didn't succeed and other foreign adversaries didn't succeed is that we had built up this remarkable interagency apparatus to spot and track and disrupt foreign plots. Donald Trump is breaking that, and that's also going to mean domestically he has a greater ability to try to make false claims about the election.